In the early 2000s, we made a film, The Corporation. We argued that large, publicly traded corporations are programmed relentlessly to pursue profit and growth and have become the dominant institutions of our time. We showed that the corporation is deemed by law to be a person, that it has the same rights as human beings, sometimes even more. So we posed the question, if the corporation is legally a person, what kind of person is it? We analyzed it the way a psychiatrist would analyze a patient. We found his character to be pathologically self-interested. Now, with the world in crisis, climate change, spiraling inequality, a global pandemic, we re-examined the corporation, how it's changed, how it's changing our world, and how it's changing our very sense of who we are.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Jessica Munger. I'm Move to Amend's Program Director. Thank you all so much for being here tonight and for taking the time to watch this film and to engage with the movement to dismantle corporate power. This month is unique. It holds several important anniversaries, milestones, and opportunities to check in about the state of the movement. This month marks a decade since the first gathering of the Occupy movement, the beginning of one of the largest swells in a generation. At the same time the Occupy movement was picking up, Move to Amend wrote the We the People Amendment, which remains the most comprehensive tactic in undoing some of the tools that billionaires and their mega corporations use to harm people and planet. September 17th, just last week, is also recognized in the US as Constitution Day. That's an opportunity we always take to talk about how big corporations have weaseled their way into our existing constitution and how we can take a constitutional approach to realizing our own movement demands. Tonight, we're going to hear from some great folks who are here with me behind the film The Corporation and now The New Corporation, the unfortunately necessary sequel, as well as two of the co-founders of Move to Amend, who have been working for decades to resist corporate power. So we've got Joel Bakken, author, filmmaker, musician, and professor of law at the University of British Columbia. His work examines the social, economic, and political dimensions of law, and you all know of his book and films on The Corporation and now The New Corporation. We're also joined by Kat Dodds, founder of Hello Cool World Media and mastermind behind the outreach and branding of the films. Kat is known for highly effective and heartfelt transmedia campaigns in film, video, print, and digital. Also talking with us tonight is George Friday, co-founder and board member of Move to Amend, among many other organizing roles. Her work particularly focuses on communication, oppression, and the role of privilege in transforming power dynamics, fostering deep economic and social justice change. And of course, we're talking with Caitlin Saposi-Belknap, national director and co-founder of Move to Amend. She's been the magic behind this work for a very long time, organizing the movement to resist corporate power and build true democracy from the grassroots up. So thanks all of you, really appreciate it. I also want to announce that we've decided to extend the screening window an extra week. So if you haven't had a chance to see the film yet, you can still see it. It'll be available on this webpage, as will the recording of tonight's discussion. So now, thank you to the one and only Keon Bliss for facilitating tonight's conversation, and I'll hand it over to you, Keon.
Thank you so much, Jessica. Welcome, everyone, to this panel discussion. I'm really honored and happy to be moderating this conversation. So just as a reminder, I will be asking you all questions, and you'll each have about 2 to 3 minutes each to answer these questions. So with that, I will jump into the first question for Joel and Kat, or Kat to answer. The original Corporation film was an extremely important film that educated and agitated so many people. It seemed as though you presented just about everything that needed to be said about corporations in the first film. What changed between now and the first film that compelled you to do this sequel?
Well, maybe I'll take a run at that. I had the idea to do it when I was watching the first film in around 2014 and 2013. It was the 10-year anniversary of the first film, and we had champagne and a big party, and we rented a theater. We showed the film. Lots of people came to watch it, and about halfway through the film, it occurred to me that there was really nothing to celebrate, that everything we talked about in the first film had only gotten worse, with the power of corporations, racial and social injustice, climate change, pollution, species extinction, workers' exploitation, whatever, you name it. It had gotten worse, and corporations had gotten bigger and they'd gotten more powerful. And so by all accounts, the first film was a failure. But from that perspective, but more than that, what really struck me as everything was getting worse, and a large reason for that being corporate power and dominion, corporations were saying that they had gotten better. It was as though they were saying, we're no longer psychopaths. We've been cured. We've had therapy. And now we're sustainable. Now we're woke. Now we're good. Now we're the ones that you should trust. And what I realized is that, the sort of insight that made me think a new film and book was necessary is not only was this bullshit, not only was it misleading, but it was actually a play for more power. That what corporations were saying is, we're better now, so let us run your schools, let us run your water systems, let us have more influence over governments, because governments are really just not working very well. And when we were shooting in Davos, the moment the penny dropped for me, and it's in the film, is when you have Richard Edelman, who's kind of the good guy in contemporary capitalism, purpose and all of that, saying, I'm not much of a believer in political citizenship. I believe in the power of the marketplace. And so his argument is that markets can be good, corporations can be good. We don't need political citizenship anymore. We don't need democracy anymore. And so the good corporation is bad for democracy. And so it was that insight sitting back there in 2014 that made me realize, wow, we really need to take another kick at this can, because this is a qualitatively different thing that's going on now. And it's even more dangerous than what was happening around the first film.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I can add a little piece to that. I can't take any responsibility for the existence of the second film, because that was all Joel and Jennifer, the co-director. But what the event that Joel describes when he had that epiphany that things were getting worse, that was something we had organized as an attempt to address what my anxiety was, which was that we had this groundswell of support with the first film. And we'd had unbelievable amounts of grassroots groups coming together to really help us get the film out into the world. And we really did not have the capacity to do very much with that momentum, with what was just a typical film promotion budget that we extended even further than it could have really realistically been gone, to keep this going. And then we actually, that 10th anniversary was an excuse to do some fundraising so that we could keep going. And the theme of it was, we're not done yet. So, well, Joe was like, the film hasn't done its work. I was feeling the same way about the campaign. Like, we made these promises, we did all this strategizing, and we had to do more. And so this is it. This is it. Now we have that opportunity, and I'm very excited that we're finally starting to see some fruit of this, what we've seeded in terms of this being another movement catalyst, which is really the dream, I think.
Well said. And this leads me to a question that came from our audience for you, Joel and Kat. It seems the film focused on electoral solutions when meanwhile, there is rampant voter suppression, money in elections, entrenched political parties, and other reasons we can't vote our way out of these problems. How do we try to make change through the electoral system when it is so corrupt?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit simplistic to say that the film was advocating simply that we get out and vote. we spent a lot of time in the latter part of the film looking at organizing, at mobilizing, at protest, at all those things. We started with the Occupy movement, and basically the story was we still need all of that, but we also need to occupy electoral politics. So it's not, and that doesn't mean we just go and vote. That means we change the system.
Mhm.
And the politicians we looked at, whether it's Shama Sawant in Seattle or Ada Colau in Barcelona, are not, their agenda is not just let's get into power and have a different platform than the other party. Their agenda is to change the way electoral politics works, and to try to make it truly democratic. And I mean, if we had more time in the film, I'd want to talk about the role of the cooperative movement in that, of the labor movement in that, of women's movements. Of, I mean, we did talk about at the end racial justice movements, but just how it's all of these movements that really need to be working, and the new kind of electoral politics that we were trying to showcase was movement-based electoral politics. It wasn't just you have these political parties, you go and vote for them, but it's that the parties are actually rooted in the movements and are committed to democratic integrity. And so, I guess my response back to the questioner is, what are we supposed to do? I mean, what we proposed is we need to change our democratic institutions so that they're actually working democratically. What the corporate sector is advocating is just abandon our democratic institutions. At the other side, there's the idea of revolution, of just upturning everything and starting fresh. But I mean, history shows that doesn't always work. It works in small ways, and we need to always have a revolutionary consciousness. But we also need to try to occupy, just like we occupied the squares and the streets during the Occupy movement, we have to actually occupy our putatively democratic institutions and shear away the corrupting influences, in particular big money and corporations.
Well said. Kat, did you have a response?
Yeah, I would just echo that too. Like, I've always been of the opinion that politics alone was never going to be enough. But I also think that we're sort of at a crisis point where it's so obvious that the political systems are so broken that maybe there's an opening for this movement-based. Well, if the old guard in all the parties would step back, and I think that's pretty clear in I mean, I'm not an expert in US politics, but my observations too, and what we see increasingly here. So this polarization of extreme opinions on both the right and the left, and this sort of broken system, this has to change or it's really going to implode. Like this I think what I'm observing, and I'm not so young anymore, is I'm seeing that awareness in the young people that are looking at this going, if they're going to have a future, we have to change the system. It's just that simple. Like there won't be a future if the system doesn't change, not a future that's livable by standards that we hold important, not one that's just, especially during COVID. This has just exposed every crack there was and widened it, including the polarized opinions as well. And the stress points are there. So like I've been calling, since the 80s, I've been calling myself a cooperative anarchist when I first heard Noam Chomsky speak in person. And that was his idea. But his message then was go and vote, but don't rely on that alone. You have to have community-based, decentralized movement style organizing. So yes, let's have it. Let's have that. Let's have it all. And if we can get a few good people into government and, widen those cracks that we're seeing, that would be amazing too. And I do see the hope of that. It's a long way to go before it's good enough, but I see the hope of that.
May I just add one thing? I know that this was more to them, but I think that this is a question that we all need to struggle with. And just thinking about it, I think that's the elected officials that were shown in the film mostly focused it on local, municipal leaders. And I think that that's where there is a lot more ability to do the part that needs to happen after we elect people to office, which is continue to hold them accountable, continue to make sure that they really are grounded in our movements. And I think what we have seen is that here in the United States, Kat and Joel are both from Canada, in case folks don't know that. So when they talk about like not knowing our politics as well, that's because they don't have to deal with them, as although Canada is no perfect place either. But here in the United States, a lot of the progressives that we have elected to Congress are really not willing to hold the line or show leadership or risk and so they kind of just get folded in with the dominant system. And if we're going to elect people to office, they have to be willing to recognize that if the system is corrupt, then their role from within the system is to help expose that and to help assist with opening people's eyes and then ultimately dismantling that. If they just get folded into the system too, no matter what kind of good intentions they may have, or idyllic ideas that they might have gotten elected with, it doesn't matter. And so that's our movement's jobs, to be clear that when we're electing people, what their role is. And as we gain more power, presumably by electing more of our own people, then perhaps that role can shift. And if we are able to grab more control of the system, then we might be able to use parts of the system to make changes. And there are, alternative policies, and there are alternative economics that we could be using. But while we don't have any power and we just have these couple people in office, we have to be clear what they should be doing. And I don't think there's a lot of understanding of the strategy of that at this time.
Really appreciate those thoughtful response. It really illustrates how democracy is not a noun, but a verb. And this next question is going to go directly to you, Caitlin and George. The film references several mass movements following the 2008 economic crisis all over the world, including the US Occupy movement. This month marks 10 years since the first gathering of the Occupy movement. How has the Occupy movement impacted Move to Amend's organizing in the past 10 years? How do you see Occupy having impacted the broader democracy movement, as well as electoral politics in the past decade?
George, do you want to go first? Or do you want me to? No? Okay. A few things. I would say that, Occupy was actually really huge for Move to Amend. And I think that, and a number of Occupy encampments evolved once it was sort of time to, cease occupying physically, town squares and things like that. Once that became, no longer a very viable strategy, a lot of those Occupy encampments shifted into becoming Move to Amend affiliates, which is what we call our chapters. And I think that was because folks saw that the Move to Amend amendment, which we also wrote like literally the week that Occupy happened, we had our call out. We had already been in existence since January of the year before, but we didn't have the amendment yet. It was just an idea, and so it was also kind of fateful synergy that we had our national board retreat and actually wrote the language, and then went through a process with our grassroots folks to finalize it in the coming months. And I think a lot of people saw that so much of what Occupy was calling for was that corporate reining in corporate power and getting our government to serve us instead of corporate interests. And a linchpin key piece of that is the legal idea that corporations have constitutional rights. That's what puts them not just on standing with us, the people, but actually because of their wealth and because they can be in a million places at once and blah blah blah, they actually have more power than us. And so a lot of people understood, and a lot of it was exciting and thrilling for us to see just kind of organically, the cardboard signs that people had saying end corporate personhood, when we had been working on this issue for, some of us, not me, but, like 5, 6, 7 years before. And then some of my colleagues, 10 years before on corporate constitutional rights. And then all of a sudden, I remember there was a San Francisco Chronicle front page story when the longshoremen shut down the docks in Oakland. And the front page picture was our Move to Amend sign using the Adbusters flag. And so, it was like kind of perfect timing and was right. Unfortunately, I think Move to Amend is facing the same issue that we face when we look at the second film. We've been doing this work for over a decade. We have been working our asses off. And yet, our Congress has almost no interest in moving this agenda forward. And so we have to really face that, we are still nowhere near the heart of power in terms of we the people being in charge.
But we do have the right remedy, and that is people-driven democracy, bottom-up democracy. The Occupy was great because I think maybe for the first time in a long time, I think you may have said, Caitlin, in a generation, but getting people to pay attention, getting white people angry, and not that anger is a good thing or a good place to stay, but it can ignite change on occasion, hopefully. And where we are now, Kat said earlier that, especially during COVID, which has exposed everything. So what may have started with Occupy, getting people to pay a little bit more attention, it certainly got people to think more and talk more publicly about poverty, about poor people. That focusing on the 1% went, wait a minute, what about everybody else? When in the US, people have, mostly white people, when I say people, I mean white people, have deluded themselves to think, oh, I'm just a middle class person. I don't have to worry about poverty so much if I run out of money before, I run out of food, money, and then the food's gone and I can't get more food. But the reality of where we are now, which in many ways is an evolution of the hundreds of years the US has been in existence for the sole purpose of making that money on the backs of whoever, at the cost of the environment, of the people, of their own humanity, from jump, which is obscene and should be so illegal right there. But instead, we have to deal with what we have now. And Occupy helped feed that. We at Move to Amend have carried that message, continue to beat that drum of truth, even when people don't want to hear it. And it's not that elected officials, on Capitol Hill these days, Caitlin, aren't just not willing to face this and take it on. I think they've gone backwards. They were turning their head 10, 15 years ago. Now they got it buried deep in the sand while people are stuffing money in their pockets and we are dying. I'll shut up. I bet it's time.
Well said. Appreciate that, George. This next question is an audience question that goes more to Joel and Kat. Why did the film only focus on private corporations and not on public governmental corporations and not-for-profit corporations? Public corporations often use the same similar playbook.
Oh, mic's off.
We get questions like this a lot. Why did the film not focus on Russian corporations or Chinese state-owned corporations, or as you say, what we call in Canada, crown corporations, or in the US, corporations like the post office or whatever that are public corporations rather than for-profit. The film, and here's the answer, the film is basically a critique not only of the corporate form, but it's a critique of capitalism. And I'm not saying those state-owned companies like the post office, or for that matter, Chinese state-owned companies or Russian companies aren't involved in perpetuating capitalism institutionally. But what makes the what you're calling the private corporation, or what I would call the publicly traded for-profit corporation, what makes it unique in the world is that it institutionalizes the fundamental dynamic and the fundamental imperative of capitalism. Other companies, other kinds of corporations don't do that. The US Post Office has a mandate to deliver the mail, to serve a public interest. Now, whether it does that properly or not, we can debate. Whether it actually sells itself out to for-profit concerns, we can debate. But in terms of its actual legal mandate, that legal mandate is not necessarily a capitalist mandate. It's a public interest mandate. A corporation has a mandate to accumulate capital, no matter what the consequences, and as an overarching legal obligation, which is why we focus not just on the fact the corporation is a person, but the fact it's a pathological person. Because what the law does is it imbues the for-profit corporation with a legal obligation to put the creation of shareholder value, which is basically capital, above every other concern, above the concern of workers, the concern of the environment. That is its imperative. And that's what capitalism is about. It's called capitalism for a reason. The production of capital is its main ism. That is the main thing that you're supposed to do in capitalism. And what the corporation does is it takes that and it literally builds an institution out of that imperative. And that is what the questioner is calling private corporations. That is what makes them unique. And that is what we thought needed looking at. Now, other people can make, documentaries and write books about the pathologies of many institutions that we deal with, government companies, Chinese state-owned companies, pension funds. It's endless how many institutions need criticizing. But needless to say, everybody can't do everything all of the time. You choose your battles, you choose your focus. And ours is on this very strange institution. I mean, capitalism itself is bizarre when you think about it. Who would create a system that is solely designed to create capital? Well, who would create an institution that is solely designed to follow the imperative of that system?
Agreed. Cap.
Oh, Kat, go ahead. I wanted to add just one thing too, though, after.
I don't have anything to add to that because I think Joel is the one that can speak most eloquently to that. So if you want to carry on, I think.
Well, I was just going to say one thing that wasn't known here, but just to acknowledge that. So the questioner asked like an extremely long question, but one of the things that was included in there, which Joel didn't speak to, which I think is relevant, is the nonprofit corporations here in the United States. And I think that it is. And they went on to kind of give some examples of how, most large for-profit corporations actually also have nonprofit corporations that they use to do a lot of the political work, a lot of the, PR and sort of changing of the culture happens through nonprofit corporations. And frankly, a lot of the corporations, the nonprofit corporations that are in Washington, D.C., doing the lobbying work, that are working on the good side, are still very entrenched with our political parties, whether they're Democratic or Republican. And so, they have staff that will, during the campaign season, work to get people in Congress, and then, work to lobby them. And all of that nonprofit industrial complex also feeds and supports capitalism. I really appreciate Joel saying, at the end of the day, that's the issue. And we totally agree with that. But so just so the listeners, fully understand the picture, because it's absolutely true. And we support a lot of those organizations that are working kind of on the progressive side, who are definitely not advocating for systemic changes or overhauling the system, but are rather looking at incremental gains that support the political candidates that they helped get in office, whose team they're on.
Yeah, if I could just follow up on that. I mean, it was unfortunate, again, time and space in the film, but I deal with this a lot in the book. And that is the corporatization of the NGO sector and of the nonprofit sector, and ideas like philanthrocapitalism and the way that Bill Gates and other philanthropists use nonprofit philanthropic organizations to pursue their capitalist agenda. And so there's no question that is a huge story. It's a story I go into a lot of depth in my book. I would have loved, and we did have segments in the film, but ultimately, due to time and space constraints that were imposed upon us, that ended up, unfortunately, on the cutting room floor. But it's a huge story, and it's a story that is fairly recent in the sense that we've seen over the last decade or 2 decades a kind of wholesale hijacking of the nonprofit sector by the for-profit sector. I guess that's the best way to put it. But also, as you just pointed out, I mean, the fundamental issue is capitalism. Is capitalism turning everything into a tool for the production of capital, including the nonprofit sector, but also including schools, also including water. Everything has to be turned into a tool to produce capital.
Yeah. And you raise a really, that actually is a great segue into our next question, which all of you will have the opportunity to respond to. The film describes how corporate agents have tried to become more warm and fuzzy in response to their increasing assaults on people, our communities, and the environment by claiming they are more socially responsible, good corporate citizens. Among the examples are the World Economic Forum's corporate and super rich participants talking about having a special responsibility to help people, and people like Jamie Dimon of JP Morgan Chase Bank sharing their commitment to revive underinvested cities like Detroit. How effective do you think their rhetoric and actions to this point have been in convincing the public and in changing anything substantively?
I mean, maybe if I can start, just because, as I mentioned before, it was that issue that really convinced me we needed a new film. It was the fact that they were being very effective. And it's not just effective in convincing the public, it's effective in convincing governments. It's become a very effective way for corporations to claim that they should be deregulated, for example, around environmental issues or health and safety issues or labor union issues. It's been an effective trope with lobbying efforts to be able to privatize, to privatize schools, water systems, social security, et cetera. So the idea that corporations are good actors now has been very effective in corporations getting governments to back off and to leave them alone and let them make their profits without being regulated and in any domain they want. So that, to me, is the dangerous moment that we're in, is that Kool-Aid that we documented with our cameras in Davos and elsewhere, that Kool-Aid is being drunk by the world elites now in massive quantities. And so now all our large problems, whether it's climate change or racial injustice or economic inequality or anything, are seen as world hunger, are seen as things that these new warm and fuzzy corporations can do a better job of solving than governments. And the implication is, so government should get out of the forum and just let corporations run things. So to me, the corporation as publicly minded is basically a concoction that says, hey, you know what? Governments are there to serve the public interest. That's what we've always believed. And we've always believed that we're there to serve our own self-interest. But guess what? We're now like governments. We now are there to serve the public interest. So we don't really need governments anymore. We can do the job. And that's a very sort of brief summary, but that's the dynamic I see, is that the warm and fuzzy thing is basically a claim that they deserve and are worthy to govern society.
Well, and I mean, I think that in terms of the question, like how effective, I think, unfortunately, that's like the biggest issue, is that it's not just that they're doing this, it's that it is working. I mean, we have the Republican Party that basically is here to destroy government. And then we have the Democratic Party that is here to create partnerships with corporations. And that's our government. And we have people who, regular voters, the regular public, that just doesn't know that there's any other option. So I think people understand that the system isn't working for them. They understand all the ways that it is clearly a failure. And I think, the pandemic especially, brought a lot more to the surface than even we were looking at before. But unfortunately, where did that outrage get funneled? It got funneled into the most important thing we need to do is get rid of Trump and have Biden. And here we have Biden literally making none of the policy changes happen that were promised. And some of the things that were, the most outrageous that Trump was doing, carrying on in a very blatant, explicit way. And unfortunately, so many people just kind of feel like this is probably all on the right track again. It's like, so that's, I think, our biggest challenge as people who are trying to change the system is to go to, those regular everyday people and help connect the dots. And that's why I think the film is extremely effective at helping understand what's going on. I mean, I'm like immersed in this, and I actually didn't know about what the Gates Foundation is doing in Africa around dismantling their education program, and that blew me away, for example. So I would encourage people to watch it, but unfortunately, I think that we're still, this is, and it's not the film's responsibility or Joel and Jennifer and the team to, answer all our questions, but like that is the question before all of us who are organizers and activists and wanting to build this movement, is how to really seriously look at, and the answers of what we are doing are totally inadequate for the problem that we're in when you put climate change into the mix, and that, and a lot of what we need to start with is facing that reality and not just thinking that if we, there's a quick fix and we just need to find it. Just the smartest person needs to tell us what it is. It's like, we're in dire situation and we're not going to get out of it if we are delusional about how bad it is.
Yeah. Yeah.
I see you, Kat. I'd love to invite you to respond if you have one, and George, feel free to chime in as well.
I think, George, you wanted to say something first? Go for it.
Yeah, go for it.
Well, it's part of the formula for getting us to the next step in hopefully as whole a piece as we can. And that is, it's really hard, y'all, but that is not to feed fear and rage too much. Instead, find ways to fuel a vision and do the work. Actually do the work. And there's lots of work to be done, especially if we're going to deal with climate change and inadequate people running for office. But don't let that sap all your strength, because it can. It can be a sinkhole of rage and anxiety. And, none of us do our best when we're stuck in that sinkhole. So if you feel yourself getting there, create some people around you that'll get you right, back on solid ground, or even better, maybe floating above the ground a little bit, imagining stuff that never existed. Earlier, Joel said something about we always have to keep our mindset in revolution, but we don't have a good history with that. We don't have a good history of where we need to go at all, bruh.
No.
So we need to know that. We have to create it because it's never existed before. So, true democracy in the U.S., racial equity, okay. What's that look like? So, it's a fun thing to think about sometimes. Yeah, better than obsessing about Democrats and Republicans and doing that us-them polemic thing. That's not going to do us any good either. It's going to take everybody. No one is expendable. Got to figure that out. Sorry.
That's what I always appreciate about George. And just to say, to folks, how important it has been that George has been part of Move to Amend all along, and having that clear perspective of at the end of the, we're in the biggest mess that humanity could possibly have concocted. And yet, we can get out of this, and we do it through vision and through community and accountability and support of each other. And that's, and solidarity. And that's what you start from to build a movement as well. And to take it back again to Occupy. I mean, I think a lot of people, the generation just a little bit younger than me, like that was the first opportunity that they, in the streets, occupying places where we weren't supposed to be, having an experience of that. And I think that, the reverberations of that moment, it's confusing about how that really is serving us. But I think that without having had that, we wouldn't even be where we are now. And we need to create those moments. We need to find the opportunities to create those moments.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like you have to not trust the crowd, but trust the feeling that comes from the movements in terms of like what that does to your sense of carrying on when you feel connected to something that's trying to make a difference, a group of people that's trying to make a difference, a movement that's trying to make a difference. And so while a lot of these movements get subverted either externally or internally, that moment of feeling the connection that people have when they're in the middle of some kind of struggle, that's the moment to kind of grasp and hang on to, I think. And then the other thing that I was just thinking, just in terms of many of the things we've been talking about, just like Joe was saying, that this corporatization of the NGO world, this kind of entrenchment of everything. I've sort of been observing that too, at the same time as there's been a consolidation of a real criminalization and fight back against dissent itself. So the NGOs have been taken over by this corporate model, and protest has been criminalized in so many ways. And I think it's always been that way for people who've been racialized. They've experienced that, but now it's the levels at which this has been happening to more and more people. So I think somewhere in the middle of all this is the principle of finding strength in your people, but also looking at the analysis of power that essentially the film does, both films, both the first film and the second film, that this is about power and it's about capital. And then the reverse in terms of like the vision has to be about justice, like just reframing. Like that's what I've noticed in the conversations, is that even just reframing things as climate justice and environmental justice and racial justice, and sort of focusing on this idea that there is a vision we should have that's justice, and that justice is what's bigger than the petty capitalist corporatized colonial mindset. That's the thread of it. And so figuring out, like, what does that look like, smell like, taste like, so that we can move beyond identity into affinity, which is actually what was talked about all the time in 1999. Remember that? Remember the affinity groups and all of that? Then that got co-opted. But getting a bit of that back, because it doesn't negate identity or the importance of that, but it actually adds a layer on top of it that helps us figure out how to work together across these borders that have been imposed on us.
Yeah, I like that.
Indeed, so do I. Next question. The way that corporations talk about social and environmental issues has changed over the past decade, but their economic priorities and actions continue to worsen existing inequalities and environmental destruction for the communities hearing them, as you all have pointed out. Can we separate critiques of corporations from critiques of capitalism? Does every nation state pursue an economic regimen of endless growth at all costs, or does scale or size matter?
Well, I'm glad that Joel just took it right there, in earlier. And I do think that, we collectively have come a long way in the last 10 years. Because I remember having conversations about how, okay, it's not going to serve us to name that capitalism is the problem. So how do we try to lead people to that from some other angle? Because if you just straight up say that, you're going to be dismissed by large numbers of people that you otherwise would be able to reach. And I feel like we no longer need to do that. And that is because we also were willing to say it, at least among our own circles, and kind of bring people along. I mean, Move to Amend, we used to talk about corporate rule instead of capitalism because that was easier for people to swallow. And so part of it is, I think we need to be thinking about like, okay, so then what's the next thing? Because, I would say that industrial civilization is also a problem. And, that might be the capitalism of 10 years ago conversation. But, we need to scale down is how I'd close it, to make room for anybody else to add in. But I was just thinking about that the other day, how that is progress. And we need to remember that, when we're in the middle of it, it can feel like, God, we have so far to go. But hey, 10 years ago, we couldn't even name that capitalism was actually the threat to survival on Earth that it is. And we knew that 10 years ago, but we still had to say it quietly.
Can I maybe
go ahead, Joel.
Add a point? I mean, firstly, I don't think you can separate critiques of corporation from critiques of capitalism when you're talking about for-profit corporations, because as I mentioned before, they are really just institutionalizations of the imperatives of a capitalist economy. And so they very much work hand in hand. It's not possible for large-scale capitalism to operate without the ability to amass large amounts and pools of capital. And that is what corporations are designed to do. And that is what they're needed for. So that's one thing I would say. The other thing I would say is I think it's important in discussions I have, people tend to be open to the idea that capitalism's a problem when you actually explain what capitalism is. Capitalism is not just markets. It's not about having a private sector or having a market as a policy tool or as a tool to produce and exchange goods. Capitalism is about every single thing in a society being geared to creating capital, which means that within capitalism, if you don't have any boundaries around it, slavery, which means wages that can't support people, exploitative labor, forced labor. The only reason we don't have those things is because our democratic governments have, over time, and as a result of a lot of hard work by activists and people putting their lives on the line and all of that, it's only because of that. It's only because people have organized and said, we're not going to take that crap. And wars have been fought and people have been killed and all of that, and the labor movement and the anti-slavery movement and all of it. So capitalism itself, though, turns everything into capital. Anything that can be turned into capital. When you explain it to people like that, they kind of say, holy shit, that's not a good thing. I mean, what kind of crazy society would say that everything, the water, the air you breathe, people themselves should be turned into capital, should have labor or whatever capital extracted from them in the form of what Marx called surplus value. That's insane. So then you say, okay, but so we can do away with that and not have capitalism anymore and have something else. And within that, we could still have trade. We could still have things that resemble markets. We could even have things that kind of operate like corporations or cooperatives or, collective organizations that are about doing business. That's fine. The problem here is a system that is fundamentalist in the sense that it reduces everything to the production of capitalism. When you explain it in those terms, most people say, yeah, no kidding. That is problematic. But people use the term capitalism interchangeably with, markets or private sector or whatever, and they forget that it's a fundamentally fundamentalist system, which is where the problem lies, and therefore just completely inhuman and completely antithetical to having an environment that can sustain life.
Right. George or Kat, I want to invite you all to share your thoughts.
Well, I would agree with everything Joel said and tenfold, and sort of say too that I think it's this colonial corporatism that is completely driven by extractivism, and this is why we're seeing such this is why the why of climate change. This is why, because we've made everything into just a resource, including people. And
Mm.
this is it's so it's so actually violent at its core. Like, that's why I would add the colonial, because colonial adds that level of violent intent, which is sort of nicely hidden under business suits and capitalism, quote unquote normal capitalism. But that's actually the agenda. It's not even history. It's ongoing. It's ongoing in so many ways, in so many different sectors. The violence is real right now on real bodies and real people, not just historically. So I think that's why I keep kind of thinking of, like, capitalism is an extreme, problematic, unethical at its core issue, and we have to stop defending it, I think, actually, and start thinking of how to explain the alternatives, which don't necessarily all mean whatever other ideas we have, the extreme of communism, which also isn't really reflected in its theories, aren't really reflected by any of the practices that are out there. So these ideas of the collective, I mean, this is what's at stake right now, I think, is that we've eroded our vision for the collective. And this is what attracts people to movements when they're in them. Unfortunately, that same impulse attracts them to movements that are quite destructive as well as progressive. But we have to understand that there needs to be a way in which we can think about the collective good outside of this relentless logic of the only way to do it is in these extreme extractive ways.
Mm.
So when Joel was speaking, he reminded me of this history endeavor that I'm participating in. So way back in the 1600s and whatnot, if you were not producing, as Joel said, a capitalist system, everything is about producing capital. If you were an individual who did not produce, you were not just poor because you didn't have an income, but they also associated slovenly with it. They were completely synonymous. If you were poor, you were de facto lazy, slovenly. If you were wealthy, you were industrious. You got things done. Now, how does that evolve to what our cultural conditioning and messaging is today about low-income folks, about wealthy folks? And, sort of dismantling those cultural norms and assumptions wouldn't hurt us.
Yeah.
Agreed. And it kind of speaks to a question too. I think that all of you have touched on around from the audience, that how would you relate this powerful insight into the horrors of capitalism, as you were describing, to the profound unhappiness, the paranoia, the fearfulness that many people in the U.S. Are currently experiencing and exhibiting here and now?
Human beings are not, we don't fulfill our sense of purpose, of meaning, of humanity, of love, of caring, of compassion through being either understood as commodities or understanding other as commodities. That doesn't work. Or understanding our purpose in life of collecting commodities, of collecting things and goods and all of that. And that's it. Of being just individuals, of not having sort of collective sensibilities and people around us who we love and work with to try to make a better world. I mean, there are so many things about being human that capitalism simply either doesn't recognize or seeks to destroy. Values. And it's why, people turn to spiritualism, to religion, to activism. We want to do those things, but we're living in a system where the hegemony, the totality says that those things don't matter as much as producing capital. And as George was pointing out, that, if you're not producing, you're slovenly, you're not worthwhile. So we have this incredibly inhuman system, but it is sort of justified and legitimated through anti-human ideas that then form the kind of that form our collective consciousness in many ways, and we have to work against it all the time, and that can make you unhappy, especially if you don't have the insight, the means, the resources to work against it. If you're just barely scraping out a living and barely surviving and subject to racism and to homophobia and to sexism and all kinds of oppressions. And then on top of that, you look at the society as a whole and you don't see a reflection of the things that are what it really means to be human. That is a recipe for just massive anxiety, depression, and unhappiness. I'm not a psychologist. That's fairly simple, but that's a simple answer to a very profound question.
I think we are seeing that beginning to unravel, though, with the overreach of the capitalist system that we are in now. And I think also the pandemic just added a layer. I mean, on one hand, on the other hand, we're deeply in denial that the pandemic is still here too, right? So all these things are like complex, but just seeing like how many, especially younger generations, people are quitting their jobs, refusing to go back to their jobs. If you look at social media, it's just full of messages of people sort of responding and naming this reality of like, I can't do the things that, like my life is really supposed to be working until I'm so old that my body doesn't work anymore. And at this point, I won't actually have like a pension or support or, Social Security. Nobody believes that will be there for them. And so like, why am I doing this? And I think that people are asking that question. I think that we are in an opportunity time to help, connect the dots, make it make sense, and empower people to withdraw from it. Like to what George was saying, I mean, there's a lot of people who identify more with like Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk than like the homeless person down the block. And like, we are so much closer, those of us who are living in houses, to the reality of being a homeless person tomorrow than we are to being a billionaire ever in our lives. People are missing that, right? But that's a really straightforward thing that can be, walked through to people that we know, or interrupted, because you're right. George is absolutely right that these cultural messages are, deep within us. And at the same time, to what Joel was saying, it's like, even despite the fact that corporate America, our government, is continuing on with the same messages of like, I mean, that's why we are still in a pandemic crisis, right? Because the only thing that mattered was getting the economy back going. And so every public policy, everything that the CDC tells us about like what we're supposed to do, all really has an agenda of, we need people buying shit and back at work. And so that's what we're going to tell people. We're going to tell people things that will help them do that. But it's like, it doesn't actually add up to people's realities. And in all of that crisis is a lot of opportunity to open people's eyes and explain what's actually going on here.
So Caitlin, you said, we've got to get to a place where it makes sense. No, it doesn't make sense. It's not going to make sense.
Fair.
Right.
We can remind people of, and I don't know which of Octavia Butler says it best, but chaos is change. Change is chaos. If you feel like you're in chaos, you are, because we're in change. We need to change. We need to focus it, name it, work collectively to get where we want, but not pretend like it's not fucking crazy, because it is crazy, and it's crazy making. So don't get stuck in the mire of fear or rage or judgment or trying to be the best white person in the room or the best ally around. Just do your work, stay grounded in a vision of justice, as Kat said, and conjure some joy every now and then.
And surround yourself with people who will help you do all of those things.
Yeah.
Like bring you back. The affinity group, is absolute, like that's what that is, right? An affinity group is like the people that you trust to fight the cops with. Okay, who are those people in your life who you would fucking go to battle with the cops and you would know they'd have your back and you would have theirs? Well, those are also the people that you need to help you if you are in a situation where you find yourself, missing wildly a privilege, and you have a blinder about it. And those are the people who are going to love you and hold you through it and help you come out and still be here and not be damaged so that you can't keep doing the work or whatever it is. It's like we need those affinity groups in our lives, and the separation that we all are being pushed to is for a reason. So part of the resistance is to just not allow ourselves to be separated in those ways.
Yeah.
Don't buy the lies.
Buy the lies. Don't drink the Kool-Aid.
Don't get fooled again.
Well said. Yeah.
As Who said, don't get fooled again.
Well said. And this leads actually to a really good question to get us thinking about, the film begins with a reflection that the enlightened dream of democracy and liberty is coming to an end due to everything being marketized, economized, and commodified. What do we need to do on any or all levels to revive the enlightened dream and make it a reality?
Wow. Do you have a few days? Yeah, all right, a lifetime. Yeah, the film opens with Wendy Brown, who's teaches political theory at Berkeley, reflecting on the fact that the Enlightenment dream, this idea of sort of democracy, of equality, of truth, I would add, of beauty, of humanity. Though let's not forget, during the Enlightenment, people were a bunch of assholes, Yeah. I mean, those people were not great. But anyways, for the moment, let's talk about these values that we all hold, democracy, equality, justice. These do come out of some of the writings of that period. And that's what Wendy Brown's talking about. What do we do to get that back? I think this conversation has really, been really enlightening on that topic, in the sense that we've been talking about, you surround yourself with people who you'll go and fight for these values with. You'll try to find joy in the fight for these values. You'll think collectively. You'll think critically about the structural and systemic ways that we repress and destroy those values. And you'll actively try to live those values, whether it's by going on a protest march or running for election or getting involved in any myriad of organizations, political parties, whatever you want to call it, that are living, breathing, and fighting for those values. That's all you can do. And so it really is about thinking about what it means to be a citizen. And I don't mean just a citizen in the sense that, you've got a passport and things like that. I mean, the real idea of community that's in that notion, of collective action that's in that notion, of democratic self-governance that's in that notion. What does it mean for you? And almost more importantly, what responsibilities do you have to defend and to propagate those values as a citizen? So I think that's what you can do, but there certainly isn't a checklist or a formula. And many of the things that we've been talking about tonight, I think, are part of what we need to do.
I just want to appreciate Kat again for bringing up the colonization and colonialism, as and because I think a big part of this also is to recognize that it's all a project of colonization. And, in a way, the Enlightenment also sparked that of like, let's go, and so we can't, in terms of what we want to get back to, it's like, let's be clear-headed about that. And there, I think Joel has beautifully articulated all the best pieces, but at the same time, there were societies and cultures that were rooted in human values, that were the best of human values. And they were, as best as the colonial project could, attempted to be eradicated, because because it was a threat to this idea of some people should have wealth and other, and also in order to do that, we have to exploit you. And when you can see, wait a minute, if I could be a human living like that, I would much rather do that than be a human living like this, toiling, laboring for somebody else's wealth, et cetera, et cetera. So it's like, if we understand that that's all what needs to be uprooted, then we've got to dig all the way back and look and find, all of us have parts of our DNA that were those people who were living the way that human beings are supposed to live and acting the way that human beings are supposed to act. And in a way, it's kind of like wooey, but that's what I've been thinking about a lot more lately, because I feel like that's really, at the end of the day, what we need to do. We need to face that. We need to face the ways that we have like colonizer mentality in ourselves. We need to face the ways that we are colonized and reject it and stand up for ourselves. And we are friggin' animals, and we are animals that operate together in collective. And so of course the collective should be, foundational to how we operate. That's a requirement for our survival, and it always has been. And we delude ourselves to thinking that that's not the case because that's what the system tells us. But that's because the system understands that if we were to tap into that, that's how we would be powerful. And so it's like, we've got all the ingredients. It's easy to say, and easier to say than it is to do, but also we also could just begin doing that and figuring that out and figure out where that would, and see where that would take us.
I want to invite George and Kat to share your comments on this question as well, but I also want to, I think this is a really good moment to interject a audience question that came in about for doing this work. Somehow it seems we need to normalize civic engagement, activism, citizenship, organizing as part of everyday life for every person. Can we make civic duty a hobby? And if we can, how do we do so?
I'm just going to say very quickly, I think the problem is it currently is a hobby.
Yeah.
I think it has to be more a vocation than a hobby.
Yeah. And I think the idea of hobby is a very kind of middle class concept, and should be a little bit questioned in the sense of like that idea of vocation, whereas Harriet the Spy would say, she thought of everything she did as work. And for those of you who don't know that book, she was an 11-year-old child who was trying to spy on people to find out the truth. And she learned that a lot of things by observing, but she didn't want to be treated like she was going out to play. This was the big thing. No, I am working. This is my work. This is my work that I'm going to do. And I think that sense of that is something that's missing in a lot of people, because they think they have jobs, and then they think they have leisure time, and then they think they have hobbies in their leisure time. And I don't know if I'm just a weird person who was completely wanted to be Harriet the Spy. Let's be honest, I was Harriet the Spy when I was 8. That really there's work to do. And some of that work involves, the way I differentiate it is, some of that work involves deliverables and requirements and editorializing from somebody else, a client, a colleague, or whatever. And then some of that work is about play and experimentation and not having to have that editorial piece. But it's all work, and it's all experimentation. It's all work. And the work that's more satisfying is the one that combines them both. Your ability to express your creativity and engage collectively in some kind of common piece where this becomes greater than your own navel gazing or whatever it is. Those are the sweet spots in this lifetime, I think, is when you can do that work together with people. Like, I can't think of anything more beautiful than that.
That's awesome. And that's basically what, we have seen that's what Move to Amend is to us. And I love that Harriet the Spy is your role model and knowing
Same
that.
here. I was digging that reference. It's been a minute.
I'm at that age when I reminisce, I feel super old, but this one's worth sharing and worthwhile. There's not a whole lot about my growing up that was awesome, worth sharing, but there was an assumption, and we're talking, 1960, 66, my preschool years. There was an assumption in my household and community that you were going to do something that was connected to changing the system. It wasn't explicit, but there wasn't an agreement, again, not a explicit agreement, but an understanding that shit was fucked up. No one used that language. We're a good Catholic family, but nobody cussed. And that everyone was expected to do something about it. And this was from, toddler to teen. And the idea, I think I was in high school or even college when I learned that not everybody's family had that assumption about each other, that everybody didn't grow up thinking, oh, I've got to do something to make things better. So yes, it should be normalized as part of everyday life. And, we ain't hating on you about using the word hobby, but it's not a compartmentalized, I'm going to go out on Saturday morning to the vigil and that's all I need to do. That's one of the things, but it's your work based on your vision of justice, based on the people that you've aligned yourself with that support that vision, hold you accountable to it, and help you win on those small wins, whether it's running for the school board or, changing a brownfield. So, you have to be consistent and it's work. And part of that work is, how do I learn the skills I need to communicate with the neighborhood where the brownfield is? So,
Yep.
There's lots of levels and lots of stuff to do.
I mean, if the system, were you done?
Nope. Just remind people that it's not boring. You won't be bored.
Yeah,
absolutely not.
If the system isn't going to change itself, which I think you could take these two movies and you could say, there's no evidence that it is. In fact, left to its own devices, it's just going to run us off a cliff. So given that, that's what we have to deal with. Are you behaving the way that you would want to behave with the life that you have? Are you doing what you would want to be doing, knowing that that's the reality of what we have to face? And I think that's to me, that's not a hobby. The problem with the hobby is also you can stop if it gets tough. It's if it's not fun anymore, and it absolutely should be fun and joyous. But we also can't part of the question too was can we require? And it's no, this has to be something that is moved from within each of us. And people get inspired by other people. Again, we are social animals. That's how we are, programmed to behave. So be inspiring, and that will bring other people to you, and you will figure out together what the best, most powerful way that you can respond to this reality that we're in. I mean, it is fucked. And at the same time, I wouldn't really want to be alive at a different time, because it's you have so much agency in this moment. Just thinking about 20 years ago, 10 years ago, when it was just tiny little numbers of people talking about this. And now we have the system showing itself for what it really has been all along, in a way that is an opportunity, I think.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit like framing duty and hobby with more of a responsibility and feeling like what your place in the work is, what work you can contribute.
Absolutely. Really appreciate all of these enlightening responses, and really this candid conversation has been super insightful. I want to give you all the opportunity to highlight the work that you are currently doing, and direct people to what work do you all want to highlight as people go forward.
Well, maybe I can start on this. You've just watched the film. There is a book published in the U.S. by Penguin Random House, a big corporation, that the film was based on. And so a lot of these issues we've been talking about are discussed in the book, including, I saw in the chat, B Corps. That's also discussed. So so if you found the ideas in the film interesting, you want to pursue them further, that's an idea. So I am currently working with Kat on suing Twitter because they censored our film. So we are suing them in Canada. I'm a lawyer as well. As you heard, I teach law. And so I and another lawyer named Sujit Chowdhury have filed a case in the Ontario Superior Court against Twitter and the government of Canada. No, we're not on the same side as Trump for all kinds of complicated reasons that have to do with differences between Canadian and US law. But that's kind of what's taking up my time these days, is trying to find a way to hold the big media, big social media platforms accountable, because increasingly they are censoring progressives and people on the left, and just in very arbitrary ways. And so we've tried to come up with a legal theory for doing that, and that's what we're testing. And Kat is one of the plaintiffs in the action, as am I, in parallel action. So that's taking up our time. We're in the middle of a fundraising campaign because doing these things cost a lot of money. If people are interested, the website, maybe Kat can put it in the chat, but if you Google Twitter Gone Rogue, that is the name of
GoFundMe,
of the campaign on GoFundMe. Yeah.
Mm.
But Kat, maybe pick up.
Yeah,
on
I
that.
can put it in the chat. Let me just do that.
Wonderful.
What's the name of that book, Joel?
It's called The New Corporation. So it's the same name as the movie, but the subtitle is different. It's How Good Corporations Are Bad for Democracy. And good is put in quotes.
I hear you.
Mm. Right on.
Yeah. Yeah. And to add to, like, if you go to the New Corporation movie, you'll find we have a page. The Take Action page is all about the Twitter case. The 1,000 Screenings page is all about what we're up to right now, which is having groups like Move to Amend host the film and conversations through our platform, which is a wonderful way to have exactly what's happening here and hopefully go deeper. We would like to have, like I was just talking to Jessica earlier today, a vision would be, what if we had 100 organizations who each held 10 events over a period of time? That could get us, a million people engaged in this conversation, which would be incredible. And we also, practically speaking, we're in a very different place than with the first film. We don't have US theatrical distribution for the film. COVID kind of cut short the beginnings of a Canadian, and it's not going to happen. So we have this alternative, which I think could be really powerful as a tool, like to be able to have a truly grassroots distribution. If we can do the 1,000 screenings, imagine that's quite something if we can pull that off. So we would invite all of you to contribute to, you have contributed, everyone who attended this, and especially who donated that money. Some of that will go to our impact campaign. Some of it's going to go to Move to Amend. But we want to just carry this forward and do more and more and more of this, so that it helps do all the good things we were talking about: build community, create dialogue, strategize, organize with organizers. That's our vision for that.
And capitalism.
Yes, exactly. Like, let's do away with it. And on that note too, like that's the irony of the wonderful irony of suing Twitter. It's like we still need these platforms to get our message out. And so, the nerve of them saying that, we couldn't advertise our film. Like, it was our trailer that you probably seen when you signed up for the page. There's nothing problematic in anything we're doing that they should be censoring. It's quite the opposite.
You are criticizing capitalism.
Exactly. Exactly. But that's the big irony. They didn't refuse to let us tweet. They refused to let us pay them to promote the tweet. So, this is a double whammy weird thing. Like, why would the capitalists refuse our money to promote our film? But in the meantime, we need it seen. One of the things I'd love to do is what if we could get that trailer projected on buildings and use that, have some kind of actions and bring that and get people to see the film through being a bit more outrageous. If Twitter won't let us buy ads, we'll take it to the literal streets. And but one of the parallels too that Joel made when we started talking about the Twitter case is that these platforms really are the new public square, for better and for worse, right? So if they can't support democratic speech, what can we do? And this is the real street corners are a source of conflict right now too, and that's what I was meaning about the criminalization of dissent and thing. I know it's happening all over the US, but I mean there's been some really outrageous things going on in Toronto with real police force taking out homeless camps, which is outrageous. Like what's going on right now as kind of not even newsworthy really events. So there's a lot of battlegrounds with all of this, and so we'd love to find a way to keep this momentum that events like this have going. And our venues for that are 1,000 screenings, and hopefully we'll win a lawsuit against Twitter, and that will not be just for our benefit. That will benefit anybody else that might have a progressive message that Twitter right now would call political speech that they won't let you promote.
Well, we'll be definitely rooting for you and hope that lawsuit ultimately ends in victory for you.
And if
George,
it doesn't,
Caleb.
that's still then that's another conversation to have too. Like you have exposed something that needs to be known.
Yeah, and I mean these platforms have so much power, and they're absolutely unregulated.
Yeah, and that's largely thanks to the Democratic Party too.
Yes.
Never going to not put that one in there when it needs to be said.
Yeah, no, and that's one of the reasons we're also suing the Canadian government, to say that they have a responsibility according to, well, Joel could explain this, like our Constitution calls for certain protections of political speech that's not harmful. So this we would argue qualifies.
George, do you want to talk about work to connect people with first, or do you want me to go first?
You probably should, because I would just talk about Move to Amend stuff, but not as well as you would.
Well, so I mean, we're on Move to Amend channels, so hopefully everybody is already connected with Move to Amend. But if you're not, you should please go sign our petition, movetoamend.org/motion, because that will link you in with our work. And we are furthering the work to get the We the People amendment passed, and we are at 70 co-sponsors in the House, and we continue, to push that. We also, frankly, are looking at, we've been doing this work for over a decade and taking stock of like where the system is at, where the culture is at, where our work is at, where our hearts are at. And exploring some other avenues as well, which we will probably do more under the umbrella of an organization called Democracy Unlimited, that was one of the founders of Move to Amend and has been kind of dormant. And actually, the work of Democracy Unlimited was in the first corporation film. It was the town hall meetings that happened in Arcata in 1998, way back when.
Yeah.
And we had a screening of the first corporation, and we were one of the few places that were able to do like a community event, since there weren't funds in that film for it. So it all kind of is coming full circle. Basically those of us who are doing this are not going to stop until we're dead or it's done, or, and if we're dead, then we will make sure there's other people who are still here. So some of the things that Democracy Unlimited already has kind of in the works that I'd like to invite you to check out, and there's probably more to come, and we will partner with Move to Amend. I'm saying we because I wear both hats, so it's a little is the People's Constitution. And if you go to peoplesconstitution.us, you can see that. That's work that really has been under the Move to Amend umbrella. And it is looking at, we need much more than the We the People Amendment to make our Constitution centered in democracy, to serve our needs. It's a property rights protecting document. That's the people who wrote the US Constitution, who wrote it to protect their property from the masses. And so it's got flaws, and it's not just the fact that the Supreme Court has interpreted it to apply to corporations, right? So what if we were to envision a constitution that actually met our needs, that actually was rooted in human rights, which a number of other countries actually do have as their foundational principles to guide their law? We do not in the United States. And so we have done a number of participatory, what's called people's movement assemblies, rooted in doing that visioning with various, parts of the movement. So, if you're working on housing advocacy, what would it look like if when you won, it was in the Constitution, so we weren't having to fight these things piecemeal, or if we were working to protect water or, the environment more broadly, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So right now, it is there kind of as just like a call for talking about this. Obviously, we don't have a government right now where it would be a good idea to try to implement a new constitution. But, Move to Amend has never been ones to say, oh, where are we at now? Let's think about what we can achieve in the world that we're in now. It's like, let's change the world and then think about what that will allow us to do. So that is a place where we're putting our vision as it relates to, why we started doing the work for the We the People Amendment in the first place. And then another kind of totally different angle is a podcast that I'm part of with my amazing and beautiful colleagues, Jessica, Millie, and Shelley, who are all also part of Move to Amend, called Agitated Podcast. And it's where we talk about what the crazy making of this reality that we're in, and how there's so much that we want to do, and yet we are thwarted, and we don't have all the answers, and it's incredibly agitating. But at the same time, agitators, that's the role of agitators, is to shake people up. So we're shaking ourselves up, and we want to shake you up. And you can find us at agitatedpodcast.com, and that's also a project of Democracy Unlimited as well. Anything you want to add, George?
Well, I want to make sure we're done on time, and that's 4 minutes from now. So
you got it.
Thank you to Kat and Joel and Keon and Caitlin and Jessica and Alfonso and Jenny and everyone who's online or watching or whatever form you're in. And remember to do the work, keep breathing, support each other, have fun. Grieve well. That can be chapter 2, is how to grieve well. Because again, you can get stuck in it, but if you don't let go of it, you don't have the energy to move forward. And there's a lot to let go of because it is crazy.
Awesome.
Well said, George.
Couldn't have ended it better.
Oh,
Thank
Lord.
You.
Oh,
well done.
I really think the Poor People's Campaign is doing groovy stuff. I like Reverend Barber. I'm pretty critical of things. You couldn't tell it tonight, but I am. And I haven't found anything that is not right on. Often they say you lift from the bottom, everyone rises. That's a good thought about how to approach the economy and everything. So that's what's up.
Yep.
Thank you, everybody. I really appreciate you having us on.
Yeah, thank you so much.
And watching the film. Thanks for everybody who watched it and took the time, or who are going to. Thank you.
And you can watch it for another week now, because you guys are awesome and have made that available. So if you
tell your friends.
Yeah.
And if there's people you think should see it, I think this is the only way to see it at this moment in the US would be to watch it through the platform. Yeah.
Right on.
Exclusive.
With that, thank you all so much. I will pass it over back to Jessica to take us home.
Uh-oh.
Nope. She disappeared.
That's all. Thank you so much. I appreciate all of you.
Thank you.
That's all.
And thanks for facilitating.
Bye.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night, everyone.
Unstoppable sound.